The old blueprint tube sits on the right-hand corner of my white oak desk, its leather strap slightly frayed at the buckle. It has been there for 20 years. Sometimes, when the afternoon sun catches the brass cap, I look at it and marvel at how easily a multi-million-dollar empire can collapse for want of a single, precise signature. They never looked closely at the foundations. They were too busy admiring the view from the upper floors. It was exactly 10 in the morning when I sat down at the heavy walnut table in the county clerk's office. The air smelled of old paper and air conditioning. My 40-year-old half-brother, Richard, was adjusting his silk tie, his face flushed with the thrill of the deal. Next to him sat Meredith, my stepmother, her diamond rings clicking against the mahogany pen she had bought specifically for this occasion. They were finalizing the structural sale of the historical family timber yard and estate to cover what Richard called a minor liquidity hiccup. When the last page was turned, Richard didn't look me in the eye. Instead, he slid a slip of paper across the polished wood. It was a final severance check for $4,200. He told me, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of heat, that my services as a design coordinator were no longer required under the new corporate restructuring. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply picked up the check, folded it twice, and placed it inside my pocket. They smiled when I signed the exit release, convinced they had passed out the family wealth with surgical precision, leaving me the scrap. The legacy left by my grandfather was never about the theatre of wealth. Richard received his vintage sports car, a machine that burned fuel and drew glances, while Meredith claimed the estate jewelry. My portion was handed to me in a plain legal envelope during the reading of the ledger in the winter of 2006. It was a single paper certificate for a $12,000 index fund, a modest sum that my stepfamily treated as a polite parting gesture for the less fortunate sibling. They expected me to spend it on rent or a reliable sedan. Instead, I looked at the trajectory of sterling architectural milling and saw where the grain was splitting. My father understood the physical density of cedar and walnut, but he resisted the digital shift. The industry was moving rapidly toward automated CNC micro-precision toolpaths. Using that $12,000 inheritance, I privately bought out the core algorithmic software licenses from a dissolving German engineering firm whose developer needed immediate liquidation. I registered the digital patents and software infrastructure under my private corporate entity, Acanthus Holdings. That same afternoon, I drew up a formal lease, granting my father's workshop total operational access to the code for a nominal fee of $1 per year. It was a standard 20-year contract, built with a strict clause stating the license was non-transferable and would automatically terminate upon the original owner's passing. My father understood the grain of the wood, but he never quite grasped that the digital toolpaths belonged entirely to me. Richard spent his first 3 months as managing director shifting our entire production model. He wanted volume. He signed high-risk commercial contracts with regional developers, swapping out our signature hand-selected white oak for cheap, pre-laminated composites to increase his personal margins. Meredith supported the pivot, publicly declaring that the business was finally shaking off its old-fashioned, rigid ways. The transition left no room for my slow, methodical quality checks. On my final afternoon, I walked through the drafting room one last time. I systematically gathered my 32 specialized drafting tools, placing each item, including my heavy, German-made steel calipers, into an old leather case. Meredith watched me from the glass doorway, her arms crossed. She casually remarked that my presence at the upcoming corporate evaluation dinner would be awkward for the new investors they were courting. I didn't argue. I didn't tell her that the automated software suite running every digital lathe in the plant was bound by the original 2006 agreement. I simply nodded, stepped out into the humid evening air, and watched the main gate slide shut behind me. There were exactly 40 days remaining until the software audit window opened. I locked my desk drawer at exactly 5 p.m., knowing that the structural integrity of their entire autumn production run was already ticking down. 3 months of silence followed. I spent my mornings on the river, watching the current move against the reeds, my mind entirely clear. The family business felt like a distant shoreline until the Tuesday morning Vaughan Finch called my private line. As the firm's veteran defense attorney, Vaughan had spent 30 years protecting my father's legacy, and his voice held a flat, uncharacteristic gravity. The mandatory 20-year corporate liquidation audit, triggered by the sale of the family estate, had finally reached the intellectual property desk. Richard's new high-volume, without my signature as the registered owner of Acanthus Holdings. The automated verification system had flagged the entire manufacturing pipeline during a routine compliance check. The bank immediately froze their $2.4 million short-term credit line, halting production on a massive luxury hotel project mid-cut. Richard had spent the last 48 hours trying to bypass the proprietary software lockouts, completely unaware that the system's security protocol was hardwired to my personal encryption key. Vaughan confirmed that the title insurers were refusing to clear the yard sale until the software lease was legally resolved. Richard called me 6 times in 20 minutes, his voice losing that smooth corporate veneer with every missed ring. The note arrived by courier at noon on Thursday. It was written on Meredith's heavy cream stationery, her handwriting sharp and elegant, requesting a private meeting at the downtown Windsor Hotel. She framed it as an urgent family matter, a quiet gathering to smooth over past misunderstandings before the public founders' celebration. I agreed to the meeting, but I did not go alone. When I stepped into the carpeted dining room, Vaughan Finch was walking beside me, carrying a single black leather ledger. Meredith was already seated, her hair perfectly coiffed, a porcelain teacup balanced in her hand. Richard sat to her right, aggressively scrolling through his phone, though his eyes looked hollow from sleeplessness. Meredith immediately leaned forward, her voice dropping to a warm, practiced whisper as she spoke of family loyalty and my father's sacred memory. She urged me to sign a standard retroactive waiver to clear the bank glitch. I sat in silence, slowly stirring my tea, while Vaughan opened the ledger, laying out 14 distinct financial accounts that Meredith had systematically drained over the last 3 years. The room went completely cold. I didn't say a word about her greed. I simply let the data do the talking. My stepmother looked at the certified audit stamp, her manicured hand trembling just enough to rattle her porcelain saucer. The legal settlement took place inside the timber yard's historic brick office, a room that still smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil. 3 alternative buyers sat at the end of the long oak table, their expressions neutral as their corporate attorneys reviewed the title insurance dispatches. Richard sat across from me, his collar unbuttoned, forced to admit to the insurers and the new buyers that he could not deliver the operational assets of the company without my explicit written consent. Vaughan Finch did not waste time. He opened my blue manila folder and slid the final settlement terms across the wood. The documents were uncompromising. I demanded complete relinquishment of Richard's executive voting shares, exactly 74% of the corporate stock, in exchange for waiving the 20-year patent infringement damages he had accumulated. Since my departure, for 20 minutes, Richard stared at the papers, while the room remained in absolute, suffocating silence. He looked toward the window, where the yard crane stood motionless, finally realizing that the silence he heard was the cost of his own arrogance. Meredith reached out a hand to stop him, but there was no recourse left. The audit had stripped away their leverage, revealing that the true heart of sterling architectural milling had never belonged to them. With 12 minutes remaining before the title company cancelled the closing entirely, Richard picked up the pen and signed his name. The restructuring began the following Monday. With 74% of the corporate shares legally transferred to my name, I instated Vaughan Finch as the interim trustee to oversee the deep forensic cleanup of the company accounts. Richard and Meredith did not linger to watch the transformation. The public nature of the liquidation audit records had quietly but thoroughly dissolved their standing among the city's commercial elite, and within 3 weeks, they packed the estate and left the state entirely. On my first official morning, as majority owner, I walked down the center aisle of the main production floor. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting scent of freshly cut timber. The primary CNC milling machines had been unlocked, and their rhythmic, steady hum filled the vast warehouse, running at 100% operational capacity once again. As I passed the old molding lines, 18 veteran craftsmen stopped their work. They didn't offer loud congratulations or grand speeches. Instead, they greeted me with quiet nods of genuine relief, the unspoken recognition of men who knew the shop was finally back in the hands of someone who respected the trade. They had spent years chasing the shadow of profit, while I simply waited for the substance of the truth to catch up.